This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 352, D7 to D9 migration. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about D7 to D9 migration with Mauricio. Mauricio is a Drupal developer at Agaric.coop and the lead instructor at understanddrupal.com. He has been part of the Drupal community for over a decade and is a frequent speaker at Drupal camps and Drupal cons. On the topic of migrations, he has been producing courses and writing articles in English, Spanish, and French at understanddrupal.com. Mauricio, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi.
Hello, internet friends.
And also joining us for the next 4 weeks as guest host is Donna. Donna Bungard is a long-time Drupal community member, a member of the community working group's conflict resolution team, and is the senior accessibility program manager for the marketing department of Indeed.com. She's a frequent public speaker on the topics of accessibility, people management, and work-life balance, along with being a mom, a foodie, a bookworm, and a nerd. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, excited to be here. Can't wait to see what we come up with.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Foodie is one of those terms that I feel like I haven't heard too much recently. I think it's more because, people are going out to restaurants less than, general world events. But I feel like 2018, 2017, everybody was a foodie. And that's
I really wasn't sure what to put there, but I figured I was doing this while I was just kind of surfing through some stuff. I'm like, yeah, I'm way too obsessed with all of that to not include it.
Okay, we do have a module of the week this week. That module is event platform.
Yeah,
John,
so I just learned about, well, that's not true. Let me preface this. I'm on the event organizers working group. A initiative of that group is to build an easier way for Drupal events to build websites. And what has come out of that is the event platform module. And the event platform module is actually a set of modules, each of which provides functionality designed to satisfy the needs of anyone creating a site for a Drupal camp or similar event. This morning, on our open event organizers working group call, we actually had a demo of the event platform module, and it was pretty cool. It was super easy. You install it like a module, you turn it on, and then you have sub modules you can turn on, and has a bunch of different features in there to help you kind of get your event website up and running. The sub modules, I'll read them off really quick. Event platform sessions, event platform sponsors, event platform job listings, event platform speakers, event platform details, which provides a new admin menu, central place to manage key information and stuff about your event, and then event platform Olivero, which allows integration with this module and the Olivero theme to make your site look pretty. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I will share the video in the show notes of that demo if anybody's interested in looking that up. But definitely worth checking out if you are running some sort of event and need to kind of get started quickly. The folks that are behind it have all been on the show before: Martin Anderson Klutz, Mike Herschel, and Kaleem Clarkson. So those guys are working hard to make this thing great, and I recommend checking it out.
That sounds like the evolution of the COD distribution from back in the day.
Yep.
Yeah, so it kind of is. The goal, I think, here though is instead of doing a distro, being able to kind of make this into an easy to install module is definitely a great step forward, I think. And kind of seeing it in action and working with Olivero was pretty cool as well.
Cool.
Yeah, organizers take on so many details. It's awesome to see ways to make it less hard for you all.
It's funny because as somebody who organizes a Drupal event, I think the website is like one of the last things that people really want to like deal with, because it's like there's so many other things to deal with. Luckily for New England Drupal Camp, Nick handles all the website stuff, so that's a great thing and a great help. But yeah, I think for new events, it could be a stumbling block for sure.
Yeah. And I'm keeping a close eye on the event platform. I think maybe next year we'll be using it. So looking forward to having a lot of that pooled in one place. So yeah, looking forward to it. So moving on to our primary topic this week. Let's start with an easy question, Mauricio. Why are you so passionate about Drupal migrations?
Okay, well, my first migration project was a little bit bumpy, and I have shared that like publicly before, but after that one, things started to get easier, and in particular with Drupal 8, the migration API changed in a way that it is now relatively easy to get started. Um, in for many reasons. For one, it's a well-documented API in Drupal core. Like the official documentation will take you a long way. Um, but also, it kind of reminds me of when I started with Drupal. When I first installed Drupal, I remember that I didn't know how to build websites, even though I had gone through a computer science course in college. They just didn't teach us how to build websites, and I felt frustrated because I had spent so much time and didn't know how to do this. And I saw Drupal, and without knowing HTML or CSS or JavaScript or many other technologies, I was able to build something useful in a short amount of time. So when I started working with the Migrate API in Drupal 8, I felt that same feeling, like I was able to produce you know, uh, content, to pull in content from different sources into my Drupal site with little effort. And the more that I interacted with the Migrate API, the more that I worked with it, I also was learning more about Drupal itself, because the API interacts with so many other layers and APIs in Drupal core itself. So it's a nice introduction to learning how to do eventually module development as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about migration too, is especially in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, the ability to create those plugins to kind of transform the data is significantly easier than I remember being in Drupal 7 migrations. Like I see myself now when I'm running a migration, I'm always writing at least one or two minor plugins. And it's just so much easier and so much better documented. Now, obviously, it's built on the foundation of the Drupal 7 migration. That I think they kind of took that as the example, but it's definitely, the documentation has only gotten better. And, the feature set has only gotten richer. So yeah, it's definitely a cool piece of Drupal.
Yeah, I'm sure it's saving people a ton of time too, right? Being able to use Migrate API and move their stuff from one version of Drupal to the other. So in that regard, what do you think the first thing people need to think about before they take on a Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 migration is?
So one thing that in terms of terminology, usually when you talk about Drupal 7 to 8 migrations, it is regarded as an upgrade process. So you're doing an upgrade in that regard. And I pointed out this out because the D7 to D9 upgrade is just one use case of the Migrate API. And I think this is not like I think it would be very, very helpful if people try to understand how the Migrate API works in general before trying to do an upgrade directly. In particular, what my recommendation is get familiar with the syntax of the Migrate API, learn about what source, process, and destination plugins are available, learn about contributed modules that might help you with your specific needs. And this is all about the Migrate API outside of the context of D7 to D9. That's just like one use case. For example, in terms of knowing what process plugins are available, in the official documentation, there is a page where you get all the process plugins provided by Drupal core. And then you also have other process plugin provided by the Migrate Plus module. In terms of source and destination, in my website, understanddrupal.com, I have blog posts documenting where the different available plugins in Drupal core and how to configure them. In terms of contributed modules, recently there was an addition to the categories of modules in Drupal.org. So if you go to the official website and you browse by category, there is now a migrate category, and that's a nice way to explore what is available. And if you go to like a project page like Migrate Plus, there is now a link on the sidebar that says resources, projects that extend this module, and then you will find and discover other modules that integrate with that ecosystem. So I would suggest that people get familiar with the API in general, and then start digging into the upgrade process itself.
It's funny you said something interesting there. Well, you said a lot of things interesting there, but if initially the first part is like a D7 to D9 migration, right? Isn't technically a migration. It's an upgrade, but in reality, like it's more of a rebuild, right? The Migrate API is really just helping you move your content from one set of fields to another set of fields, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Migrating API in core is responsible for two things, migrating content and migrating configuration. So, for example, you will get the content types migrated, and once the skeleton of the site is, in place, you move on, you move the content itself, like the individual entities.
Right, right. Interesting.
So if in that use case, I know this is only the one use case, that 7 to 9 upgrade migration, however we want to call it, what would factor into our estimate, and what would be a reasonable kind of allotment of time for us to estimate this out? And where are the pitfalls, where are those hidden problems that we can avoid?
Okay, so as many things in life, it depends. I have worked on projects like small and large. For a small website that mostly uses Drupal core functionality and that uses contributed modules that provide an upgrade path, like a week is a reasonable timeline. On the other side of the spectrum, I have worked on projects that take 7+ months to get completed. And one thing to clarify is that this 7 months is not only about working migrations, scripts and the like. It is actually that the site is so complex that building the site takes 7+ months, and along the way, it's like a factory. So there is people building functionality on the site, and as they build the functionality, I work on the migration part of things. Like I start migrating content into whatever they have built. When that's the case, you need to be mindful of changes that are introduced, because if they change the content model at some point, you need to upgrade your migration scripts. But for the most part, these longer projects is because of that, because it's building something bigger and migrating along the way.
So it sounds like those factors involve the size of the site, the different content types, the mapping of those content types, maybe redirections and things like that. Those are the kinds of factors that are going to play that biggest piece, or did I miss something important?
Yeah, all of that. If I were to like itemize, I would say one big thing to consider if it is the site is multilingual or not. So that's will increase the complexity. Another thing is if you need to migrate revisions, or you only need to get to keep the current version of the different entities. Another thing is I alluded to this before, but if the modules offer an upgrade path or not. In some cases, the D9 module is a different one from D7, but there is a clear upgrade path between them. So if that is for granted, you don't have to write your own migration for that. Also, any data model changes will impact the complexity. And this can happen at different levels. For example, you can have at the field level, going from field collection to paragraph, or going just from the body field to layout builder. It can also happen like at the ecosystem of modules level. For example, if you were using organic groups in Drupal 7 and now you want to change to the group module in Drupal 9. Or it can happen at the distribution level. If you were using Ubercard and now you're migrating into Drupal Commerce. If you
Yeah.
were using Open Atrium and now you have a custom D9 installation profile. So you need to consider all of this. And going back to one of the initial questions, about exploring what modules are available, there are specific modules for some of these. For example, Commerce Migrate is one specifically about migrating from Ubercard to Drupal Commerce. Um, and there is a media migration module that will help you a lot if you want to go from like plain file entities in Drupal 7 to media entities in Drupal 9. So you need to do a little bit of research, but those are like the big categories to look for.
So I want to circle back to something you mentioned too in passing, because you said migration is available or responsible for two different things: migrating content and migrating configuration.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of mind blowing for me, because I'm realizing as you're talking about this, like, yes, it is for migrating configuration as well, but I don't think I've ever migrated configuration. Do you find that that's a common use case? Do you actually migrate configuration often, or do you usually just migrate content?
In my experience, you would migrate content only like 90% of the time. There have been there was only one project that was a very small project that they basically want a clone of the site, and we run the automatic upgrade script, and we got the configuration, we got the content, and we did some tweaking. There was another project in which there were a specific part of the site that they wanted to keep, in particular taxonomy vocabularies, so we migrated those. But for the most part, we only migrate content. And Drupal 9, like going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 is a good opportunity to change your content model, leverage new functionality that is available. So most of the time, we do not migrate. At least the projects that I have been involved, we do not migrate configuration.
It's good to know I wasn't missing something big, because, like I said, it's not something that I've really thought about. But it does sound like it's powerful when you need it, but it's not something that a ton of people need. So I'm curious about, we talked a little about what to think about when you're starting a migration project. Obviously you need to think about the information architecture. How's the data model changing? Is it changing? What kind of feature sets are changing? That kind of stuff. What tips and tricks do you have for people that are thinking about a migration that might make it easier for them to catalog that information? When you're starting a migration project, where do you store your documentation, and what questions do you ask?
Yeah, there are a couple of modules that try to help with this. From what I know, the last time that I checked, they were alpha versions. They were only available for Drupal 8, not for Drupal 9. But I guess the intent of the modules is still valid. And basically what they do is that like they scan your Drupal 7 database and they create a spreadsheet with the content model. So you have so many content types. You have these fields, this configuration for this field. And once you have that spreadsheet, then you start making decisions like this is going to be mapped to A or B or C. And the goal is you have this picture of how my content model is going to change from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, and then the job of the migration or the developers working on the migration is to like connect the dots.
What's the name of the module?
I would have to check, and maybe we can put it in the show notes. But yeah, it was something like that. And in general, like even if we want to go back into like general Drupal site building, there is probably a 10-year-old blog post at Palantir that is called Drupal Planner Parish, in which they have basically what I was describing, like a spreadsheet in which you describe your Drupal website. It's like a template of that website, and that can be a a reference to what you build in Drupal 9. And just to give an example of how important this is, the other day I was working on a project and we were migrating media. And for some reason, the media was like not coming through as we were expecting. And the reason was because in Drupal 7, um, there was a view mode that we didn't have in Drupal 9. And we hadn't thought about the view mode for the file entity in Drupal 7. And the quick was fixed once you figure it out. But even at that level of like, I would say the view mode configuration is something that you don't think at first, but just in general, it is good to keep in mind.
Great
It's
tips.
interesting. So we talked a little bit about Migrate Plus and some other modules and tools. I'm wondering if you could dive into those a little bit in a little bit more detail, or talk about any other helpful tools or modules that you like to use when migrating.
Yeah. So well, Migrate Plus, there are basically three modules that I use all the time: Migrate Plus, Migrate Tools, and Migrate Upgrade when working on a D7 to D9. Migrate Plus is like a general purpose toolkit. It provides a lot of process plugins that you will be using often. It also provides a user interface to migrations. There are some caveats there. Migrations can be defined as plugins. Migration can be defined as configuration entities. So only for configuration entities you can define you can have a UI for that. But that's one of the benefits of how Migrate API works now. I have given courses in which we write very complex migration just from the UI, just writing YAML files and never writing PHP code. So that was not possible in Drupal 7. And with the way that Migrate API works nowadays, plus modules like Migrate Plus, which give you the interface to run the migrations, it is now possible. In the case of Migrate Tools, it is a migration runner for the most part. So you get the opportunity to run the migration themselves. This is something that I was like a requirement before, but starting with I think was Drush 10.4, the Migrate Runner was integrated into Drush core itself. So
really?
it is now optional. Like you can now run the migrations just with Drush directly. But if you have Migrate tools installed, now you are able to, there are some features that didn't make it into Drush core, like for example, filtering the migrations by tag. So, excuse me, by group. So that's something that you get by installing the module. And there are also a couple of process plugins available there. And then Migrate Upgrade is like magical, I guess. You install the module, enable the modules in D7 and D9, run it, and you basically has a best effort approach to getting an automated upgrade to the site. Usually, I run this automatic upgrade process at least once every time that I work on a project, just to get a sense of the complexity of the project itself, like how many content types will I be migrating, or like how many taxonomy terms, or different like entity types, different migration that I will need to consider. And then I start cherry picking what I need for my specific project. But I usually run the automatic procedure at least once. And depending on what I learned from that first run, I might run it again using a different set of modules if I need to.
Interesting.
I love the word of magical. That always works for me when it comes to this stuff.
It's magic. It is.
Auto magical, right? No, that's fantastic. So you mentioned earlier though that like as much as all of these magic wonderful tools are out there, like that D7 view turned out to be a bit tricky. What are some of these other things that are trickier to migrate in this process?
So I think that the content model changes depending on what you're trying to do. Can be easy, can be hard, and something that I have learned with Drupal in general, but in particular with the Migrate API, is that the ecosystem is always evolving. So something that was hard before, probably it's easy now. And to give a concrete example, field collections to paragraph, that is something that is very common. And throughout the years, there has been a patch that was like working and then not working and then working and then not working and then worked. So for the most part, now it is very easy to do a field collection to paragraph migration. But in the past, you needed to do a lot of work. Another area that is still kind of like fluctuating is views. Views usually, the official stance was there is no upgrade path for views, but the community saw the need and people started working on it, and now there is a module that goes a long way into automatically upgrading views for you in Drupal 9. So
Okay.
the recommendation is keep in mind, keep on top of changes. Like in Drupal Slack is a good place to ask the current state of things, and um, yeah, that's usually what I do.
I mean, one of the nice things too to keep in mind about migrations is generally, I mean, they're a project, but generally they're a point in time migration. So obviously there are a class of migrations where you run it every day, every week, every month, and those need a certain level of stability. But for a lot of migration projects, especially D7 and D9, many times you're doing a one-time migration. So as long as you can get a version that's working at a point when you're ready to make that switch, you can migrate it, and it doesn't, like the field collection is an example. As long as the field collection stuff works when you're ready to actually migrate the data for the final time, that's all that matters. Now you want that stability long term because the next project you want to be able to have a similar process. But a lot of times I find with migrations, it's a little bit different than a lot of feature projects because the feature has to be stable long term. The migration has to be stable when you're testing it and when you're ready to use it. But a lot of migrations, once they're done, you discard them because you're on a new platform.
Yeah, about that, there is something like the Migrate API can be used and abused in many ways. Something that I have seen, for example, is projects that use the Migrate API in a similar way to what Feeds provided in Drupal 7. That is, we have like a cron job that runs every day and pulls in new content. So you're basically using the Migrate API on a daily basis. And going back to those like long running projects that I mentioned before, um, in those cases, it is not it is common that it is not possible to have just like one cutoff date. So what we do is prepare the migration in a way that it is incremental. You are able to run it. At one point, things keep changing for a week or two. Content is being entered on both the D7 and the staging D9 side, and then you run another migration. You test, you continue like polishing, you run another migration. So those are challenges, especially for large projects, in which you need to consider like how the migration is going to behave when you are entering content on both sides and running the migrations multiple times. And one interesting case that on a project that I worked before, and this is what I highly suggest, get familiar with the API in general, not just with the upgrade. In this project, we had it was a Drupal 6 source site. We had a staging Drupal 9 site, and we also have spreadsheets. So we were pulling in content from D6, from D9, from the spreadsheets, and all of that made it into the final version of the migration. So it's possible because you just like point to a different source, even in the same migration project.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And I definitely, like I said, I definitely have clients where we have both those use cases where, it's a nightly migration, but also incremental migrations where, hey, we just need, a stub of this type of content where we just have the title and an entity reference and the ID. But then later on down the road, we're going to migrate all the images. And then later on, we're going to migrate additional information, sales information, stuff like that. So you can also just incrementally improve the migrations and rerun them. But I think the majority of migration projects are, just those kind of point in time migrations. You run it once you get it working, you run it once when you're ready, and then you never touch it again. So you've talked about some of the more common data structure changes between D7 and D9. One of the most common is probably field collections to paragraphs or to storage or to any number of other, kind of micro content modules. How do you kind of go through the process of determining how much the data model should change? Should it become a taxonomy? Should it become a paragraph? Should we use layout builder or migrate to that? What's your thought process, and how do you present that to the client?
So usually we start from scratch in the sense that, yes, we have the Drupal 7 site for reference. We inquire about, what works, what doesn't work in the current site, what are the pain points. And that is just like a reference. But when starting to build the site in Drupal 9, it's let's try to leverage the best of the best, the tools that are now available. And we start with that in mind. And we, you know, we think about the migration itself later. There are some considerations that, timeline, budget, and stuff, but for the most part, you want to have a solid like configuration in Drupal 9, like a solid set of modules, and usually the migration is just like a fraction of the whole development of the site, so it's not something that should affect that should sway you one way or another. In general, just like try to use the best tools at hand, and we can go over some like specific examples of things to migrate and how easy or how hard they are. For example, if you want to change entities, you had nodes in Drupal 7 to store user information, and now you want to store them with proper Drupal entities, user entities in Drupal 9. That is, for the most part, a one-line change in the destination plugin, and you
Yeah.
basically have a mapping of properties from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, so it's relatively easy to do. If you have like fields that you were using in Drupal 7 that are not available in Drupal 9, you have to dig a little bit deeper into the database tables to figure out how the data is stored. And in Drupal 7, usually that means looking at hook field schema to see which subfields are available, which columns are available in that table. And in Drupal 9, that means looking at the field type plugin, again, to see what subfields and what columns are going to be available and how the data is stored. But that will allow you to make like completely uh, changes like from one module that has nothing to do with the D9 implementation. You just basically inspect the data to see how it is stored, and you make the corresponding changes. And you can also go from D7 files to D7 media, and in that case you look at the entity level. How do I migrate one entity into another, or how do I establish the relationships among the different entities?
Okay. I mean, I would say, just from my perspective, media is one of the most complicated things to migrate. Not because media is hard to migrate, but because you have to chain so many migrations together generally to get it done. Like if you're like you said, if you're migrating files from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 into a media system, that especially if it's like a translated site, then you have to run one migration that moves the physical file into Drupal 9. Then you have to run another migration that creates the media entity and then assigns the file to it. Then you need to run another migration that's if it's a paragraph, the paragraph that media is in, or if it's a node, the node that's in, and assign it. Then you need to do each of those again for every translated language that you're doing. So I think that for me is always the most painful, because just you almost always have at least 3 migration levels that you have to go through, and then you have to run each of those migrations when you're testing and iterating and fixing things. So it's not that any individual step is difficult, but the global, like getting files from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 in a media library, in a media system, just takes more migrations and takes a lot more care and finesse.
Is it more complex than a paragraphs to layout builder migration, do you think? Or has anybody ever done a migration like that? I mean, I imagine it's a lot of like field mapping at that point, but
So, like in my experience, I have done both, and I would say that media is more complex because when you migrate into layout builder, it is true that there are some nested entities and some serialization that needs to happen in there. But once you figure it out, it's pretty much straightforward. In the case of media, there are so many variables. Like you could use the core media embeds, you can use entity embeds, you can have just like individual fields, or you can have the media embedded into the body field. So there are more variables when talking about media than when talking about layout builder.
No, I just whenever I think about hear all this, I keep thinking of the frankly when I was playing the role of the content strategist on sites, I throughout migrations, I can think of how you might be partnering, and if there may be opportunities there to make this a little less painful from that content strategy perspective of maybe not making it as complex of a transfer. Are there opportunities there, or is that
Um,
another case by case?
well, if we want to bring up the word magic again, the media migration module is magic. It just like it does so many things. It has thought about so many different use cases that if you enable it, you run it, and if it works just like you expect, then that is an easy win. The complicated part is when you need to deviate from the norm or from the assumptions that are made by the module.
Does that
Um,
Okay.
does that include like embedded media? So I know previously you may have to write custom code for embedded media from D7 to D9. Is that module magically,
yes,
air quotes again, handling that for
yep,
you?
yes, it does.
That's
It
awesome.
does. And there is
Wow.
actually the module now. That's one of the modules that has been evolving over time, and the authors of the module now have a separate module which is a dependency, and it is literally called Migrate Magician that does a lot of things under the hood.
Migrate wizard. It's gonna be a thing. Just wait. So kind of along the same lines of what Donna was talking about, and kind of like data management and like your base data set, right? Um, is there a lot of kind of data management that has to happen, before you start your migration?
I would say that and this is going back to tips of Drupal migrations in general. You do not have to write a script, a migration script that is 100% perfect. Sometimes it is easier to do a cleanup in the Drupal 7 site or your source site. It is 7 or 6. And sometimes it is easier to do a manual cleanup in the final after the migration has been completed in Drupal 9. So it is you just like need to analyze the situation, and if writing the perfect script is going to take you, 10 hours, and updating a few notes manually will take you 30 minutes, you go the route that takes less time. But usually you try to automate as much as possible, and when you hit the 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 roadblocks, then you start making decisions.
So speaking of data management, before starting the migration, I think some of that kind of feeds into like the source of the data as well. Like I'm interested in how often and how you decide what source you work with, whether it's a CSV or JSON or a direct database connection. Do you have a preference, or does it really just change depending on kind of what you're moving?
So in the case of a D7 to D9 upgrade, for the most part, it is given for you. It's for granted. You are connecting to a SQL database,
Hmm.
and uh, there is a lot of modules, not modules, excuse me, a lot of plugins that are thought to be able to read from a SQL source. The only times when you like reach out for other sources is what I was describing before. Maybe you have a long running project that you need to um, enter content in multiple places at the same time, then you reach for JSON sources from CSV sources, for other
Hmm.
Drupal 9 sources. But most of the time when you work on an upgrade, you're reading from a database. You're reading directly from the database. So there is a Drupal module in core called Migrate Drupal, which provides a whole suite of modules that allows you to do this process.
We're not necessarily talking, or obviously we're focusing on D7 to D9 migration, but if you were doing, I think we talked about it earlier, some of those repetitive tasks or repetitive migrations where you're migrating in content, then you might be using like a CSV as your source or some other source method there, right? I would imagine, but
yeah, there are it's interesting, and the community has done amazing work to be able to read from different sources. Um, CSV, Excel, open document spreadsheets, JSON, Git files, HTML files, plain text files, iCal. Like if you want to import from calendars, the number of source plugins that are available is pretty vast.
I'm laughing because I'm just thinking like CSV is probably the worst. Like one open or missing cell is like you're all done. You might as well just throw the migration away at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have validations on the migration, but yeah, I think that's interesting because I find personally, maybe it's the type of project I work on, but I find that if the destination data model changes too much, that the direct database connection usually is not very helpful. And maybe it's just because I haven't looked at it again in a couple of years, but I find that usually just writing some sort of, as part of the data cleanup process, usually some of the the JSON sources, I'm writing some custom module on the Drupal 7 site to kind of collate the information in a way that makes the migration a lot easier. Or, if it's a small enough data set, then I'm just writing a view that exports it to a CSV. And then because you're using a view, John, you don't end up with missing cells or anything. You just write the view the way that you need to. And then you have a good, easily repeatable source. Is that something that you find yourself doing as well, or do you really just start with the database connection, the upgrade module, and then go from there?
So most of the projects that I work on, I usually start with the database and upgrade, migrate upgrade. But that being said, something that I have done in the past is, for example, in Drupal 7, you can have like views data export and create a CSV or a JSON out of it, and then that's your source. One of the very first migration project that I work on, I actually use a Python library called Beautiful Soup to scrape the website, create a CSV file, and use that as my source. Because in that particular case, it made more sense to do it that way.
Wow.
So, you have a lot of tools at your disposal, depending on how much of the website you need to migrate. If it is just a subset that can be exposed in a view or two, or if it's the whole thing, then you choose one or the other.
Yeah, I gotta get a point of clarification here from Nick. So are you suggesting that somebody creates a view to export a CSV to then use that CSV as your import method for your migration, as opposed to just connecting directly to the database?
Yeah, I mean, if you have, like I said, sometimes it's easier to create. If you're flattening, for example, if you're flattening a lot of entities into one entity, it's many times it's easier just to do that in a view.
Okay.
I mean, like
All
I said, it's not.
Feels like an extra step, but hey, whatever. Let's carry on.
So I'm
Definitely
gonna
not.
totally just let these guys work this out, have their issues work it out. I'm gonna change the subject because I heard earlier about understanddrupal.com, and I'm hoping you can share a little bit about that with us.
Yeah, so Understand Drupal is it started as a blog, and it has evolved to being an online learning platform in which I share what I have learned about Drupal. For the last couple of months, the focus has been on Drupal migration, Drupal upgrades content. But what I want to do is I wanted to be the guy that I wish that I had when I started with Drupal. And meaning, for one, content on site building, content on module development, content on theming, on Drupal migrations and upgrades, basically writing to my past self to be able to help other people. But another focus of the site is providing content in multiple languages because, for example, I am a native Spanish speaker. I was fortunate and privileged enough to be able to communicate in English and understand the online documentation. But I know that not everybody has that
Of
privilege.
course.
So I want to be able to offer content in other languages for other communities to benefit as well.
I think that's awesome. I only speak one language myself, at least so far. And the idea that you're breaking down that barrier is just really cool.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about who the target market is too, but has the audience grown? Who else do you think if somebody's somewhat advanced in migrations, are they a target audience for Understand Drupal or not?
Yeah, at the moment, I have a course on Drupal migrations as the Migrate API in general, but in the coming month, I will be releasing courses on specifically, Drupal 7 to 9 upgrades. And both for the existing course and for the upcoming course, there are like basic, intermediate, and advanced levels. So I would say that it is also useful for, developers with a lot of skills in Drupal in general that want to learn Drupal migrations because, like going back to the barrier in beginning of the podcast, I mentioned that my first migration project was bumpy, and it was kind of unexpected because by then I had been doing Drupal development for about 5 years. So I thought, oh, a new API, just like read a little bit about it and you will be done in no time. And it took me weeks to finally complete that project, and it was a relatively simple task. So now I am able to, distill, years of experience and knowledge into a course that in a couple of hours, you learn
Yeah,
basically a lot. For
and,
you,
and I'll
even if you're, mhm. Yeah,
oh,
I was going to say, even if you are an advanced developer.
Yeah, and I was just gonna second that. As a somewhat experienced migration writer at this point, the amount of times that I click on the Understand Drupal kind of documentation when I'm looking for the correct syntax of something, like I'd say it's probably 50-50. I mean, every migration project I end up on the core process and migrate plus plugins documentation on Drupal.org, and then anything else, I always end up on understanddrupal.com. Because even outside of the course, just the blog post of 31 days migration, which I think is the first thing you talked about on the show. It gives you concrete examples of like, this is how you migrate something. So if you're just wondering what kind of process, how the process plugin can be formatted, it's a great resource even just for that.
Yeah, I have those are also my bookmarks, the list of process plugins and the blog post that I wrote. Like, that's what I said. I wrote to my past self, and I also write to my future self.
Very cool.
That's awesome.
So can we expect, or have we seen any new content coming out on understanddrupal.com in the coming months?
Yes, so the plan for the rest of the year is one, release a course on Drupal 7 to 9 upgrades. Also release a code on site building, like like basic site building concepts, and evolve into how to use features and more advanced functionality in Drupal. And also, it's almost 3 years since the release of the 31 Days of Migration series, and it is long overdue for an update. So I am also planning on updating the whole series as well. The ecosystem has changed significantly since I originally wrote it, so I think it deserves some love and be
I
updated.
I do have a feature request. If you can add examples of using multiple fields as an ID, that would be really helpful. I talked about this on the show a couple weeks ago, but I had to I wrote a migration, and the source data didn't have an ID. The unique identifier was across two different fields. And I ended up using a tool called Miller, which I had talked about on that show, which is a CSV JSON processor. So it's a really great way. Another tip for our listeners: it's a great way to kind of manipulate the data if you need to before you run the migration from the command line in a way that's repeatable. But my first thought was, hey, Drupal supports multiple fields as IDs, but I wasn't able to get it working. So I shifted gears.
How do you have multiple unique fields?
What do you mean? So
does it just combine them as one ID at some point?
Well, yeah. So if you think of like product and color, and each one can have more than one. Each combination is unique, but there's the same color will be multiple times, and the same product will be multiple times. So the unique ID is two different fields, but individually, neither one of them is unique.
One comment about that: in the current course, there I think it's in the basic course for the regular migrations. One of the examples is about migrating CSV files, and the CSV structure doesn't have unique IDs. So what we do is combine like the first name and the last name, under the assumption that that combination is unique, and that becomes my ID of the migration. But one thing to keep in mind is that that will depend on the source plugin. So it's not the same when you are using CSV as your source, or JSON, or SQL. So it is possible. I have written, and there are, everything that I produce is open source. If you go to github.com/dinarcon, you will find everything that I produce, like the code examples there. When you subscribe for the site, it's mostly for the explanation. So there are examples already about doing that, but it will depend on the source.
Yeah, I definitely recommend you check out Miller too, because again, it's one of those things, like you can write that into the migration, but it's probably slower than just having Miller process it. I mean, listeners can go back and listen to that show if they want more detail, but the short of it is it can process a 1.5 million row CSV in less than a second. So it is very quick and very easy to work with. So Mauricio, thank you for joining us. It's great. It's been great having you back on to talk about migration from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. And for our listeners, they can always go back and listen to episode 295 if they want to hear more details about the 31 days of migration that we just mentioned. That was the first time you were on the show.
Cool.
And that might have been me. That might have been the first episode I edited too. That's why I remember so well. So if listeners also want to see how much better my editing has gotten over the last couple of years, compare and contrast this episode with 295.
And one thing, if you are interested in learning more about D7 to D9 upgrades, I have given two presentations. One is called Upgrading to Drupal 9 using the Migrate API, and the other one is Unraveling Drupal's Migrate API, that talk about this topic of, the planning process and also the execution, how to deal with content model changes and other challenges. So we're going to drop some links in the show notes for your reference.
That's
and
great.
Of course, understand Drupal.com. I'm planning on start writing and producing more content there in the near future.
You have a busy year ahead of you, it sounds like.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Definitely.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's book corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button.
So, Mauricio, again, thank you for joining us. If our listeners had questions for you, what would be the best way to get in touch?
Usually, I'm very active in the Drupal Migrate channel, in the official Slack community group. You can also reach me via Twitter at DinarCon, or via email at mauricio@dinarte.me.
And Donna, if our listeners want to get in touch with you?
Oh, I'm on Drupal Slack. I'm on a few of the individual camp Slacks, Twitter, LinkedIn. You want to send me an owl, that's pretty cool too.
And what's the username?
I'm usually D Bungard. I'm either D Bungard or Donna Bungard, anywhere you look.
Perfect. And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And listeners can find me pretty much everywhere online at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys
Bye.
next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.